If you ever go to Houston, boy, you better walk right.
Early one Sunday morning in August 1959, two white Houston police officers pulled over a 1952 Dodge, driven by a black 27-year-old law student named Eldrewy Stearns. He was headed home from his night job as a cocktail waiter at Houston's prestigious Doctors Club.
And they stopped me and asked me to get out of the car, and they were very unpolite and polite, and I told them that I had constitutional rights and that I was a law student and that give me a ticket and let me get on. And then they asked me to show them my wallet.
Stearns, an Army veteran and graduate of Michigan State University, had only an out-of-state student ID card, but something else in his wallet caused him far more trouble with the officers.
A white girl was pitching them. I said, boy, what are you doing with a white girl pitching? I said, that's a friend of mine from Michigan State University. I told them that I had a right to do that, and you don't have any rights. And threw him in the back seat of the car, police car, and jammed the billy club on my side.
The uppity Eldrewy Stearns was arrested, charged with lacking a valid driver's license.
And they took me on down to the station, and two others got a hold of me. He says, a smart nigga here, and we're gonna do something about him. Took me into a darkened room, and I tried to put up a fight. And there was no match with them.
Bruised and hurting, Stearns remained incarcerated for several hours, but his arrest ultimately would propel him into the leadership of a unique, homegrown civil rights movement. Between 1960 and 1963, Stearns and fellow student protesters would attack segregation at lunch counters, railroad and municipal facilities, hotels, theaters, and restaurants. The way Houston responded to these provocations spawned one of the strangest and least known tales ever to emerge from the American civil rights movement.
But my great long time, oh, little green light special, shining light on me. Well, now.
Since the late 19th century, law and custom throughout the American South had dictated rigid public segregation of the races. In Houston, as elsewhere, under this Southern-style apartheid, blacks were not only denied admission to white public schools, colleges, and universities, they also couldn't eat in white restaurants, sit down at white lunch counters, watch movies from the orchestra of white theaters, or sleep in white hotels. This was the system known as Jim Crow.
But it was embarrassing to go to the courthouse with your client, and you'd break for coffee, and you'd have to walk 2 or 3 blocks away to get it. You couldn't even go in the counter. And these are your clients, and you're arguing at the bar of justice for them.
In previous decades, African Americans in Houston helped lead the Texas chapter of the NAACP. Its legal fight against Jim Crow had culminated in 2 big Supreme Court victories. But throughout the 1950s, NAACP leadership in Houston faltered. An impatient younger generation began to doubt whether the purely legal tactics of their elders would ever truly erase segregation.
Well, you go into an establishment, your money is green, but yet you had a water fountain over there that was dirty and it had color written on it. You had a restroom, if you had one, it was around the back somewhere. For a restaurant, you couldn't go in the front door, you had to go to the back window to get your food if you got it. And it wasn't a condition that you would want to print in the history book to have your kids to say, this is what America was like.
In 1959, metropolitan Houston contained over 1 million people, 1/4 of them African American. Even though it was already the largest city in the American South, Houston still yearned for national respect. In an effort to win some, it soon acquired a Major League Baseball franchise, built the world's first dome stadium and maneuvered politically to become home of the nation's manned spacecraft program. Still, Houston's politics and social practices remain those of a provincial southern city. But all across the segregated South, a social revolution was brewing. This storm had not yet reached Houston when Eldrewy Stearns boldly stepped before the city council to protest his treatment by police.
Well, I remember as though it was yesterday, they had justice, liberty, freedom on the walls of city council. And I singled those out and told them that's what I was there for.
Louis Welch, a young, ambitious city councilman, pressed for an official investigation of Stearns' charges. Local newspapers gave good play to the story, and an aggressive young television reporter named Dan Rather showed up at Stearns' evening workplace, the Doctors Club, to interview him. At the time, Eldrewy Stearns was a first-year law student at Houston's Texas Southern University, known as TSU. The mostly black school had been established as the Texas State University for Negroes by the Texas legislature in 1947. Legislators intended to sidestep a lawsuit demanding that African Americans be admitted to the University of Texas Law School in Austin. After he appeared before the city council, Stearns emerged as something of a celebrity on the TSU campus.
But I didn't particularly like being a celebrity for having my butt kicked. You know, I wasn't very proud of that.
After his appearance at City Hall and an interview with Dan Rather, Stearns was fired from his night job as a cocktail waiter. But he was soon hired as youth director at the South Central YMCA, located near TSU's campus. The executive director of the Y was Quentin Meese, a transplant from Iowa and decorated Air Force veteran. Meese was dismayed by Houston's rigid segregation. He became Stearns' boss and also his civil rights mentor. One afternoon in February 1960, Meese was at the Y, preparing for an evening NAACP function.
Eldrewy came in from school, from Texas Southern University, where he was a law student, and seeing the microphone, the sound system was all installed, he went up to the head table and began orating, Gettysburg Address or something. And when he finished, he asked me what did I think of his recitation. And I said, well, it sounded good. I said, good and all, but I said, I'd rather see you and your fellow students at Texas Southern repeat what's going on over there in North Carolina and Georgia and some other places over there in the Southeast.
As Stearns walked across campus the next day, he found that a few TSU students already were planning to launch Greensboro-style sit-ins in Houston.
H.L. Zachary, a big, tall, lanky, black-skinned fellow, approached me and said, you know, they're having a meeting at room 214. See, and they want a leader to come and lead them, and I told them that I knew where to find one, and I found you.
I was in my office there at the YMCA, and he stuck his head in the door and said, Mr. Meese, we're the sit-in movement in Houston. So I said, well, when are you going to start your protest? He said, well, this afternoon.
A few months earlier, a young minister named William Lawson had come to Houston as professor of Bible at TSU and to direct the Baptist Student Union. Returning home one night in February 1960, he and his wife noticed the lights were on at the Student Union.
And when we went in, we found the BSU crowded with these angry students, most of whom were not members of the Baptist Student Union.
One of the protesters that evening was Curtis Graves, a young TSU student from New Orleans.
The process had started in other cities, and we were bothered as students, restless students, that nothing had happened in Houston.
And they were saying, we're going to sit in like the students in North Carolina have been doing. And we need nonviolent instruction the way Dr. King gave to the students in North Carolina. Well, I was shocked. I was stunned. And I said, "You're going to do what?" And they explained that they were going to sit in at the supermarket that was near us.
There wasn't a lot of anything other than, well, it's happening in some other cities, and we want something to happen here.
And I said, "Do you know that you're messing your future up? If you get booked and go to jail, you may never be able to get a civil service job. Chances are that you can't serve your country. There are numbers of things you can't do. Why would you take a chance like this?"
The notion of complacency and docility just was, that was not where many of us were.
And they told me in no uncertain terms. They didn't come asking my permission as to whether they could protest. They came asking if I would give them nonviolent instructions so that when they went to jail, they would know how to react in jail. But if I didn't want to give them the instruction, they'd find it from someplace else. And so I stammered and stuttered once again, trying to tell them something about the hazards of this kind of unprepared, unarmed confrontation. And they walked out of the Baptist Student Center and left me there. And I still didn't understand that a page in history had turned.
On Friday afternoon, March 4th, 1960, 14 neatly dressed students held hands around the flagpole on the TSU campus. They sang the Star-Spangled Banner and marched to the first sit-in west of the Mississippi River.
And we were walking off the campus and did not know whether anybody would be behind us when we walked.
As they strode toward the nearby Weingarten supermarket and its segregated lunch counter, they were joined by other students.
When we got to the door, there was a telephone booth. And notice the police was not there. And the press was not there. So I says, "Oh, God, what have I done?"
Stearns wanted the press on hand to report the students' protest, and he wanted the police, in spite of his own experience, to protect his group from racist whites.
And I withdrew to the telephone booth and then made sure the police was there and made sure the press was there.
The students filed inside the front door, occupied the stools at the lunch counter, and politely asked to be served. White customers left without finishing their meals. A crowd of about 100 TSU students milled in and around the store.
They closed the lunch counter. They didn't know what to do about us. They were baffled because this had never occurred before.
Energized by the news reports of the first supermarket sit-in, hordes of TSU students soon joined the protests. The lunch counter of Madding's drugstore near the campus was the second target for the student sit-ins.
Well, there were enough people to fill all the stools. And the people who were serving us were to serve us behind the counter just froze and stood there. And a carload of toughs, I'm told from Galveston, who kind of looked like what you would think of now as skinheads, came in with leather jackets with the skull and crossbones on the back. I thought to myself that this is the end, because I just knew that I was going to be stabbed in the back because they walked up behind us. Just at that moment, this police officer walked through the door. And he didn't say a word to them, nor to us. He just walked through the drugstore. Eventually, one at a time, they walked out of the drugstore, got in their cars, and they drove away. And it was all over with.
TSU, whose students organized these protests, was a state school, and its administrators were accountable to white politicians. This put Dr. Samuel Nabrit, TSU's president, in a difficult position. But in a speech to an assembly of students, Nabrit let them know that he was on their side.
I indicated to them I did not intend to take any steps to interfere with their activities.
3 days after the first sit-in, violence suddenly erupted. A young black man named Felton Turner was abducted at gunpoint near the TSU campus by two masked whites. They drove him to a remote wooded spot, took out rope, tied his feet together, and hung him upside down from a tree. he finally freed himself and got medical help for his wounds. His abductors had carved 2 rows of the letters KKK in his abdomen. The police never found his tormentors. With the sit-ins at Weingarten Supermarket continuing, City Councilman Louis Welch told the chain's president, Joe Weingarten, that he had a novel idea to solve the grocer's problem.
The integration already was present vertically. We rode on elevators together.
Welch's plan to stop the sit-ins was to eliminate the very places where the protesters sat.
Yes, to take out the stools and just have the counters around where they could stand. Take out the tables and let them just stand to eat. They did that for a little bit.
The removal of the seats was part of what Weingarten considered the deal. If they removed the seats and served everybody, then we would no longer have a complaint and people would start shopping again.
But Louis Welch's vertical integration plan didn't work.
You could have fired off a scattergun in that place on any given Saturday and not hit a soul. And this was a store that was just overloaded with customers under normal circumstances.
By now, the protests had caught the attention of Houston's mayor, a genial Mississippi-born lawyer who was determined to quash the demonstrations.
Mayor Cutrer invited a group of the students down to his office, 2 or 3 of them. They went down. And the students thought that they could go down and make some demands and get some agreements from the mayor. But they didn't understand Cutrer, and he wasn't about to do that at all.
And he took the position that he was working from a position of strength, and that, you know, we just were a few hot-headed students. We didn't have the campus behind us, and that we should just, you know, he wasn't going to tolerate so and so and so forth. And so the position we took was, which was shocking to him, was that, you know, we have nothing to talk about.
Student protesters made their statement with picket signs when the Argentinian ambassador paid a visit to Mayor Cutrer. Led by Eldrui Stearns and Otis King, they marched around City Hall singing church songs. After an hour or so, they walked inside to the cafeteria and asked to be served. To their surprise, they were.
John Doc Miller, a young fella at that time, went down and got the first cup of coffee. Came back rubbing his stomach, saying that's the best coffee I ever had in my life.
Some of the employees who were sitting in the coffee shop were getting up and leaving their trays and their food and walking out. And the elevator opened, and here comes Louis Welch, a little pipsqueak. I don't know if you ever seen him, but he's a little tiny short guy. He can't see what's going on, he's too short. So he elbows his way through, gets up by the window, looks in, looks around, takes in the situation, and he says in a loud voice, "We don't all have to be darn fools, do we?" And then he walked in the cafeteria, picked up a tray, ordered food, walked over, sat down at a table right beside the students. Didn't sit at the same table, but sat at the table beside them, started eating, and started talking to them. Defused the situation just like that.
But this triumph was short-lived. Whites boycotted the cafeteria, and the white operator, once again, refused to serve blacks.
Sometimes we couldn't go as fast as all of us wanted to, because to have gone that fast would have created the confrontation that would not have been good for either side. We had to just take it a little bit at a time.
By bringing their protests downtown, the students once again antagonized Mayor Louis Cutrer.
He made the statement that if the students didn't stop, that he was going to lock them up. And immediately Sheptrine went on the air and indicated that they had violated no law and that the mayor would have to lock them up because he wasn't going to. This left him in a dilemma, which he saw like Pontius Pilate did. He washed his hands in the sense that he called the committee meeting of the citizens.
The 37-member biracial committee, which included NABRIT, students Charles Lee and Diana Lott, and a black lawyer named Aloysius Wycliffe, met in secret sessions. It was chaired by Leon Jaworski, a lawyer and president of the Houston Chamber of Commerce. Jaworski was a stout advocate of the racial status quo.
He asked the group to censure the students for their sit-in activities and threaten them with being locked up for violating private property if they did not cease.
Thus far, the students had been acting on their own, with no national leadership. Convinced that they needed help now, they aimed high.
We made a call to Dr. King and explained to him the problems that we were having. And he was quiet and subdued. And when it was over with, we were quiet to wait for him to say what he was going to do for us. You know, I'll be in on the next airplane. I'll be right, I'll send one of my boys, and they'll get you out of this problem. I'll send Andy Young. I'll send somebody. But instead of saying any of those things, he said something that took both Al Drury and I by surprise, and that was, very quietly, very calmly, he said, "I'll tell God about it." Well, when somebody tells you that they'll tell God about it, and they're Dr. King, you think that they'll tell God about it, and you really have no answer. And we said, "Thank you," and we hung up the phone, and we both stood there and looked at us and one another for 5 minutes, saying, "What was that?"
In the secret sessions of the biracial committee, Aloysius Wycliffe challenged Jaworski's proposal that the students be censured for their sit-ins and jailed if they persisted. He asserted that the demonstrations were legal and peaceful and morally correct, and proposed that the city desegregate immediately.
Jaworski called for a vote on the two positions. And 19 of the people present voted that the city should desegregate, as opposed to just 3 that supported Jaworski. Then he really lost his marbles. And he wanted to make sure that nobody knew what had transpired in there.
The biracial committee was dissolved or whatever it was, but things seemed to work themselves out. And our leadership, the student leadership, seemed to have been in charge and continue the process without any real adult help that we knew about.
In fact, the students had been getting much adult help behind the scenes.
Through these businessmen in the community, we had a little, I called it a war chest, but they made contributions. The YMCA had a food service there, frying hamburgers and everything else. And then there was a sort of a courier system where they would be taken to all of these restaurants, cafeterias, cafes where they're going, so that they wouldn't get hungry and restless and leave to go somewhere. We wanted to keep them on the job.
Next, the TSU students asked Houston's black consumers to hit merchants right in their cash registers on the Saturday before Mother's Day.
We felt that that'd be sacrificial if you can sacrifice something for Mother's Day, like Christmas or something like that, you know. Don't buy on that day particularly, you know. Then you be getting them involved.
By shifting their sights from supermarkets and drugstores near the campus and taking the battle downtown, the turf of the white business establishment, the students had greatly raised the stakes for Houston's power structure.
And logistically, we thought that was really fantastic. We were able to coordinate that and pull that off and actually move on that many places at one time.
A week later, the students targeted Foley's and 3 other downtown Houston stores. This no shopping day was phenomenally effective.
Well, we went over pretty good. We didn't get anybody downtown. It was a ghost town. Yeah, they didn't come downtown, particularly Foley's. because I'd gotten on the radio, KYK, and said that damn Foley's, just stay away from it.
When they took aim at Foley's, Houston's largest department store and retail advertiser, the students struck a municipal nerve. Foley's vice president and publicity director was Bob Dundas, a hard-bitten, old-style lobbyist and political fixer who helped plot strategy for the downtown establishment. Dundas kept a detailed diary of the protests and of white reaction. He was haunted by his memories of August 1917, when black soldiers stationed at Houston's Camp Logan rioted against police brutality. Dundas began meeting regularly with Mayor Cottrell, Leon Jaworski, Bill Wallace, who headed the Retail Merchants Association, Houston Post publisher Ovida Culphabi, and John T. Jones, Houston Chronicle publisher, then the most influential member of the city's power elite. Meanwhile, black leaders began making their own overtures to the white establishment.
With the students engaged in this protest movement for desegregation in Houston, we needed some connection or entree to the business community.
Hobart Taylor, a black entrepreneur and political ally of Vice President Lyndon Johnson, contacted the head of the Retail Merchants Group, Bill Wallace.
To the extent that we could get them to, through behind-the-scenes negotiation, voluntarily agree to open up some of their establishments, that in that way we could bring about orderly desegregation to Houston of public facilities.
These overtures seemed to soften the attitudes of the city's white leadership, and especially to moderate the hardline stance of the elite's chief problem solver, Bob Dundas. John T. Jones was another crucial influence on Dundas. At this time, Jones chaired the Houston Endowment, the trust created by his late uncle, banker-developer Jesse Jones, long the city's premier business leader. The endowment owned the Houston Chronicle, the Rice Hotel, and other downtown buildings.
Mr. Jones was the catalyst, the one who did a heroic, well, a yeoman job of that. When I say heroic, I don't think he would approve of that. He wasn't out doing anything on a white horse, but he was quietly making the necessary contacts with the leadership in the community, especially the establishments that these protests were directed to.
Working with Hobart Taylor and John T. Jones, Dundas developed a plan. Since each store feared reprisals from segregationists if it desegregated its lunch counters alone, Dundas convinced all the downtown stores to integrate at the same time.
There was a need to do it quickly and quietly, just to prevent potential opposition from having time to talk to each other and get mobilized and organized and get themselves worked up. It's sort of like the old cowboy westerns, you know. Before you can lynch somebody and hang him, break him out of the jail, you got to go to the saloon and talk to each other and get drunk. Well, this is, just don't give them time to do that.
Bob Dundas promised operators of lunch counters that if they would agree to desegregate, he could ensure that there would be no negative publicity. Indeed, no publicity at all.
Then it was very easy to get the television stations owned by local families and the newspapers owned by the same local families to not say anything about what was going on.
Implicitly invoking the leverage of Foley's advertising dollars, Dundas convinced every newspaper, TV station, and radio station in the city to ignore the fact that lunch counters were desegregating. Dundas called it the blackout.
He said, Jack, we are planning to have an integration, and I wonder if I get the newspapers and radio television stations at the market, they will all agree. Would you agree not to have your stations publicize it for 1 week?
Both Harris and Dundas feared that Houston might be edging into a race war.
I said, right after the war, when I was in Nashville at WSM, I went out to cover a race ride in Columbia, Tennessee. And there's nothing more frightening. I had been in several landings in the Pacific, but I was never so frightened as I was when I was in the midst of the aftermath of a race ride. And that is something that we don't want in Houston. No story is worth that kind of violence. So I'll agree that we won't do it. And I said, have you ever seen a race route? And he said, as a matter of fact, there was one in Houston after World War I, and I was a small boy, but I did go to the morgue, and I saw the bodies lined up. So I know even more than you.
Dundas scripted the entire plan for desegregating lunch counters. TSU's Samuel Nabritt and black businessman Hobart Taylor agreed to send only one or two well-dressed African Americans to selected stores, where counter managers and waitresses had received instructions on how to react in case of violence. Less than 6 months after the first sit-in, 70 lunch counters in department stores, drugstores, and supermarkets quietly began serving black patrons. The newspapers and broadcasters said nothing.
We didn't mention it for a week. I had no reluctance to discuss it after the event. As a matter of fact, Time magazine called me, and I told them exactly what I had done. They were critical in their story of the Houston media for covering up the story.
The powers that be realized that the momentum of the movement was dependent upon publicity, and if they could just shut off the publicity, then it became more and more difficult for us to get people to be with us and to get contributions to assist us.
It's the conflict and the violence that makes the news, and that's the nature of news. All we did was to diffuse it for 1 week. And it's true, it wasn't very newsworthy after that.
We couldn't get any news anywhere because the sponsors had told them, don't let this nigga get all this news, you know, in so many words. And because they found now that news is what was keeping us alive.
But the news blackout didn't merely let the air out of the protesters' tires. It also deflated segregationist attempts to undo what was by then a done deal.
The counter demonstration that was started at Foley's 3 days after it had desegregated petered out because of the fact that it was too late.
Still, the students couldn't revive their flagging movement for almost 5 months, until NAACP lawyer Thurgood Marshall advised the students' attorney, George Washington, Jr., of a recent Supreme Court ruling. It held that interstate travelers in bus or rail station restaurants and coffee shops couldn't be denied food service because of their race. The students decided to test this ruling. When they arrived at the Union Station coffee shop, the manager blocked the door with a chair.
I said, why can't we go in? And he said, well, the coffee shop is closed. And I said, but you're serving those white people right inside, because there was people in there being served at the time, but he had stopped us from entering. And he said, who's in charge here? And I said, I am. And he said, well, who else is with you? And I pointed to people, and he said, you're all under arrest.
These were the first mass arrests of demonstrators in Houston, and the protesting students were delighted. They knew the arrests would galvanize the movement. After all, there was no keeping mass arrests out of the newspapers nor television. Arrests were indisputably news.
We laughed going into the paddy wagon. We laughed as we were booked that night. We laughed as we were fingerprinted. We laughed as we were put in the holding tanks. We laughed about the whole thing because we thought that this was the way that finally we would get some attention for the process. Eventually, I think it was George Washington, Attorney George Washington, that came that night to get us all out.
Later, when the bonded out students appeared in court, Washington didn't show up. Their bonds were forfeited and the students were jailed.
The prisoners treated us like royalty. People were told to get out of their bunks. There were 7, if I remember right, there were 7 or 8 cells, and each cell would sleep 8 people. But there were 150 people incarcerated in that cell block. Whoever was in charge, the baddest prisoner in the joint, said, "These people have been doing this for us." And he said, "You get out of your bunk, and you get out of your bunk, and you get out." He told various people to get out of their bunks, and we slept in their bunks the first night. We anticipated that we'd be out before morning. Well, that didn't occur. About the second day, we started worrying as to why nobody came to get us, and we couldn't communicate with anybody on the outside. There was no word coming in, and we couldn't get any word out. Washington was using us to raise money.
Because we knew that the students had no money to fight anything, fight those kind of cases. We didn't know how far those cases would have to go.
The police continued to arrest and jail the students for unlawful assembly. The arrests energized the student protesters and generated new financial support in the black community. For weeks, demonstrations and more arrests became a daily ritual at Union Station.
As fast as you could put students in jail, somebody would bail them out. We could go to a Mac Hanna, we could go to a John B. Coleman, and we could say, "Look, we got 40 kids in jail, and each one of them has $250 bond, and they're going to take final exams in 3 weeks." They would come up with the money, and they would get the kids out of jail, and the local city establishment would wonder, where did that kind of money come out of the ghetto?
The Union Station protesters faced a strategic problem. The authorities had been charging the protesters under Texas law with unlawful assembly. To invoke a federally protected right to eat in the train station, their lawyers concluded, blacks would have to show that they had come to Houston from another state.
And that is when we made contact with the Congress of Racial Equality in New York. They staged a trip from some point so as to be moving in interstate commerce when they got here.
There were 12 of us, 12 of them. There were 6 men and 6 women in each group. And we met them and went, they had the interstate tickets, and we were there to meet them. We went into the coffee shop to attempt to get service, and that's when we were all arrested. I can recall singing, you know, we were into singing a lot of really great songs, great music came out of that period. And we would sing, and then Harris County Jail, on 301 San Jacinto Jail, has a very lousy ventilation system, but it's a great telegraph. Because we would sing, and the guys would pick it up, and they would sing back, and we would have the whole building rocking. It would drive those jailers crazy. I remember some old broad coming up with a billy club, running it on the bars. Are you free runners? Gotta cut that out now.
The students were soon convicted on criminal charges of unlawful assembly.
And we appealed the case to the Court of Criminal Appeals.
The state's highest court ruled in favor of the students. But black Houstonians looked beyond coffee shops and lunch counters. At the time, former mayor and county judge Roy Hofheinz and other Houston investors were angling for the first Major League Baseball franchise in the South. The team would play in a dome stadium Hofheinz liked to call the 8th wonder of the world. Since the nation's first indoor stadium was to be built with public funds, Quentin Meese and other black leaders threatened to oppose the bond election unless Hofheinz guaranteed that the stadium would open fully integrated.
That got their attention because we could vote. And we assured him that if they could give us that assurance that there would be no segregation in the dome, then we'd go all out in campaigning for the Dome Stadium.
Hofheinz and his partners agreed. Then Meese and his colleagues wrote to the chairman of the National League Expansion Committee, Walter O'Malley, who was about to meet in Chicago with the Houston delegation. Mises' group warned that they would urge Negro baseball fans across the country to boycott the game if Hoff-Hines and the other local promoters didn't keep their promise.
The first thing, before they got any other negotiations, Walter O'Malley laid that letter and wanted to know now, what about this?
The expansion committee granted Houston a franchise with a stipulation that the dome would be fully integrated. As soon as Hoff-Hines returned from Chicago, he called Mies.
But he says, Quinn, was it necessary to send that letter up there? I say, well, Judge, some of us felt we ought to have a little insurance.
But the stands weren't the only thing that would have to be opened for baseball to come to Houston.
And I said, Roy, have you thought what will happen when the Giants come to Houston? I said, they will want to stay at the Shamrock Hotel. And you can't have Willie Mays and the other ball players staying at a segregated hotel. I said, they won't stand for it. And Judge Hoffman said, well, that's a problem we're going to have to face pretty quickly, aren't we?
John T. Jones spearheaded the effort to persuade hotel operators to desegregate.
They tried to convince me that it was too early to have put it into effect, that I was rushing things too much. They thought it was going to be a disaster. And to a man, they thought it was going to just be absolutely disastrous. And they were very pleased when it didn't turn out to be that way. When the Rice Hotel was integrated, we had one person move out, that is all.
Houston's 11 convention hotels quietly desegregated on April Fool's Day, 1962. For the second time, the Houston media did not report the big news. 10 days later, the first baseball was tossed out, inaugurating Houston's major league era. Before long, Willie Mays would be sleeping comfortably at the Shamrock Hotel. But Willie Mays still couldn't watch a movie from the orchestra section of downtown Houston's grand movie palaces. And of course, neither could local blacks. Since early 1961, the TSU students and their allies had been standing in at the Metropolitan, Lowe's State, and Majestic theaters, seeking admission to the all-white sections. But to the students' intense frustration, the police made no arrests. Then TSU President Sam Nabrett passed along crucial information from lawyer Thurgood Marshall.
Marshall suggested that we alert the students to the fact that the one way that they would be arrested would be to block an exit to a theater where you could cause a panic by the commotion or sound or something like a fire or something of this sort. Well, the students wanted to get arrested, and they did just that after being alerted that this was the way to get arrested.
Elsewhere in the South, segregationists dug in their heels. In October 1962, President Kennedy sent federal troops to restrain a mob bent on stopping a young Negro named James Meredith from registering at Ole Miss. In April 1963, Martin Luther King Jr. began leading protests against segregation in Birmingham. Authorities responded with police dogs and fire hoses. President Kennedy addressed the nation.
The events in Birmingham and elsewhere have so increased the cries for equality that no city or state or legislative body can prudently choose to ignore them.
Urging calm, Kennedy asked businessmen and prominent blacks to help desegregate public facilities peacefully. Because the Houston Endowment was the landlord for 3 of the 4 downtown movie theaters, Hobart Taylor contacted John T. Jones. Taylor suggested to Jones that the theaters and restaurants could be desegregated the same way the lunch counters and hotels previously had been.
I don't know how long it took Taylor to do this, but I recall distinctly when he called me and said, well, I just left John T. Jones' office, and he's going to work with us.
Local theaters delayed taking action, kicking the decision back to their chain headquarters in New York and Washington. Like the theater managers, Houston's white restaurant owners, who had never served blacks, were nervous.
We were concerned that we might lose quite a bit of business, but we didn't see any alternative to doing it.
Now the protesting students found a heaven-sent opportunity to dramatize their cause. On May 15, 1963, astronaut Gordon Cooper undertook the last and longest flight in the Mercury series, one designed to show that the United States could fully compete with the then leading space power, the Soviet Union. On Cooper's return to Houston, May 23rd, an internationally televised ticker tape parade was set to take place. The students planned to stage their boldest and most controversial protest yet, an extraordinary action sure to garner news coverage that would humiliate Houston in the eyes of the world.
What we wanted to do was to wait till the parade was right in the middle of Main Street, down near the center of downtown, and we were going to totally block it by breaking out of the crowd, both in front of it and behind it.
Jones was scheduled to meet with theater chain executives in Washington, D.C., the very morning of the parade.
So the negotiations were going on, and I guess maybe say 11 o'clock was our fail-safe point, which was the last time the people were to call in to ask us if it was a go. And at that point, we would have said go. They would have passed the word to the people in the crowds. The signs would have come out from under the coats, and they would have rushed into the street.
By late morning, thousands of Houstonians lined the parade route, and journalists from around the country converged on the city. The students' decision whether to disrupt the parade hinged on whether John T. Jones could convince the theater owners and restaurant owners to desegregate almost immediately. At the last moment, with less than an hour to spare, John Jones made separate phone calls to Hobart Taylor and President Nabrit.
He called me from Washington and told me that the next Thursday the theaters would be open. And I relayed that to the students.
The restaurants, cafes, cafeterias were open in the same manner that when Mr. Taylor called me and said that he had just received word from Mr. Jones that agreement had been worked out with the restaurant owners.
The parade rolled jubilantly down Main Street. 300,000 people watching on the sidelines had no idea that another page in history had been turned. Out of the public view, white and black businessmen secretly worked out a plan to desegregate Houston's movie theaters and restaurants.
Hobart Taylor and his committee, and he had others working with him, he assured me personally that it would be done quietly, that there would be no rush of people coming in, things like that. There'd be a quiet operation, same things for the theaters. Be a small group or two groups, something like that, just coming in. And he kept his word. It was exactly that way.
Yet again, the media blacked out a central event in the demise of Jim Crow. Protesting students were prevented from claiming the first fruits of their victory. Instead, the black business leaders chose the cream of Houston's small black professional class to carry out the plan.
Well, the first thing I did was to tell Jeannie that we were going to have dinner. And she said, well, wonderful. And she said, where are we going? I said, well, we're going to go to George Dendler's Pier 21 on South Main to have dinner this evening. She says, you're kidding.
I said, you mean the George Dendler Pier 21? Because it was just off limits to us, so to speak.
When we arrived at the restaurant, Jeannie and I, the hostess met us, and I think she was, as I recall, busily looking down, doing the chores of the hostess. She looked up, and she said, yes, may I help you? I said, yes, we'd like dinner for two, please. She said, oh. And she dawned on her, she says, they're here. They're here.
People were so unfamiliar with this sort of a situation. And it had been so predominantly white in these restaurants and no black customers that when a black customer walked in, all heads turned.
But noticeably, the hostess took us sort of far removed from the center of main activity where the diners were being served. And she sort of took us off to the side a little bit, you know. And I did take note of that. And we sat, and immediately we were besieged with people coming to give us service. And first appeared one waiter, of course, and he had his towel draped and very proper. Yes, and he brought hot bread and all, you know, that goes with the service. And then another waiter or two came, and finally we got about 3 waiters standing, and I thought this was unusual. In my own mind, I suspected they wanted to be sure we were pleased with the service.
There's a little porthole in the kitchen door.
And finally, a face came to the porthole and looked, and with all exuberance, she flung the door open and said, "Hey, Professor Gaines! Hey, Professor Gaines!" And I heard her say, "That's my children's principal." And so it was one of the patrons of the school where I was principal. And I could see that face today, full of pride that here is one of us coming in here to eat in this restaurant where I have worked in the kitchen back in the back. And the pride was there, and that face again will always be stamped indelibly in my mind.
1, 2, 3, 4. Like many other American cities, Houston is thought of as a place where nothing happened during the Civil Rights Movement. But much did happen in Houston. 3 groups changed the city's history. Black and white students who protested relentlessly against Jim Crow. Black businessmen who stepped in to support the struggle but stayed out of public view. And a few influential white business leaders who finally implemented change with the aid of 3 news blackouts once they saw that continued racial strife would damage the city's economic future. But it all began with the students.
If you ever go to Houston, boy, you better walk right.
Some of our YMCA leaders, board members, were concerned about allowing them to meet there. And I told the board members that they were help fighting this battle that some of us had been engaged in, not only present generation, but past generation, and that if we denied them an opportunity, then who is going to carry on this fight?
Now, to the midnight specials now, shine every loving light on me. Let me tell you something.
So you had a kind of running teamsmanship between moneyed bourgeois blacks who would never carry a picket sign and angry civil disobedience blacks.
Knife and fork on the table, ain't nothing in my pan. And if you say a thing about
movement gives you something to look forward to, because it gives you a certain commitment and a certain amount of discipline that will allow you to put self aside and think about what effect will my life have on others.
special, yeah. Shine a loving light on me. Look, let me tell you something. Well, jumping little Judy.
It represented a major contribution of our personal and professional lives to participate with those students. It helped to make Houston a better place to live. And number 2, it justified the legal process.
Just a while before the date. Well, she brought me the news that my wife was dead. That started me.
Bob Dundas was invaluable in this. I think Houston owes him an absolute mountain of gratitude.
That started me to thinking about my great long time. Oh, little green light special, shining light on me.
I would say the movement was quite successful. but my personal opinion, segregation is here, is live and is well.
Well, I remember as though it was yesterday, they had justice, liberty, freedom on the walls of City Council. And I singled those out and told them that's what I was there for.
Let the midnight special shine a loving light on me. Y'all didn't hear me. Let the midnight special, yeah, shining light on me. Well, now, let the midnight special, oh yeah, shine a loving light on me. One more, let the midnight special shine a light on me. Well, now, Lulu, midnight special. Shine every loving light on me. Well. If you ever go to Houston,